you know, are interested in work from all over the world, might be in the middle of the night right now, so we want to make it available. But it's very informal. We have a lineup of speakers. We have, as you can see, a Zoom. We would like to give the impression that we are all sitting in the same room. Feel free to use the chat function whenever you have questions. We will stop a regular interval, and for questions we can't tackle in the discussion, we will try to tackle in the chat at the breakneck speed or after the session. So I'll kick us off today. The topic of the session is whose data is it anyway? And thank you for the slides. What we have planned is that I'll just give you the next slide, Ernesto, please. A scoping of the session of what we would like to achieve today. We have particular expertise, as you know, on the INPA-bond data set, so we will share what data we are able to access easily and which is more difficult to just keep the discussion grounded. I have a lineup of very exciting speakers that cover different perspectives of the outcome-based commissioning, outcome-based partnering ecosystem. So I have somebody speaking as a provider, as an outcome funder. I have an intermediary, and unfortunately, we also had an investor who is unwell today. But I know we have investor people who work very close with the investor in the room, and I hope they will not shy to come forward with their views and suggestions. We have 3 guiding questions to guide the discussion, but as I said, we'll try to keep it quite informal. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, just saying who you are and where you're calling from. Yes, next slide. In terms of the scoping, I have this simple slide. Everybody seems like our community is a community of data enthusiasts, and we think data is really, really helpful to inform our decision, to create learning. And so on the left-hand side of this slide, I have the benefit of being able to access data. Just put some examples. Like often we say we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to make it evolve and generate ideas, compare, and build on the experience of others. So I have here a quote from Newton: "If I've seen further than others, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants." So people who have been trying to do things before, if they share their learning, allow us to go further. So there are many advantages, and we know about accessing information about what has been tried and done. However, when you, and I see as a GoLab, we've been asked several times, can you set up a repository of information? Do you have a repository of contracts? Do you have a repository of outcome metrics? Do you have a repository of pricing? And everybody thinks that that's an important public good and public asset, and an academic institution like ourselves could play the honest broker in curating and some quality assurance in providing that information. At the same time, when I ask people who tell me, do you have this data, if they can share the data they have to put in their repository, then suddenly it becomes difficult. It becomes difficult in part because there is a lack of clarity on what can be shared. Some information may be confidential, some could be commercially sensitive, and there is security. And so there are genuine questions on, can I share the data? And then even when one thinks, well, I'm probably safe in sharing this data, there is a cost to sharing the data because we need to fill in a template or collect the information, and we are all very busy. So despite the desire of having a publicly available asset of information and data and insight from the experience of others, there are genuine challenges in making this happen. So the session today is trying to tackle the first of these points on what can we share publicly. Like, do I have the right to, do I own the data? Do I share the data? And when we set up the question, I hope I could come up with a very clear default position. And but my dear friend and colleague Rory told me, like, it's not that simple. There are different jurisdictions, different organizations, different organizational norms. So we need to talk about principles, but we will cover the principle. And today we have with us Daniela from Freshfield. She is a finance lawyer with a lot of expertise in the space of outcome-based contracting. I think she's been involved in more than like 35 impact bonds, both in high-income countries and low and middle-income countries in the past 7 years. She's been working very intensely in developing a contract template to simplify the creation of impact bonds, but by having thought through those are the things that you need to think about and how you can put in a contract. And she has been supporting us at GoLab in developing guidance on how to contract when you are in civil. So I asked Daniela to kick us off by giving us some of the pointers. So she's not an expert in information and what is data ownership, but she knows enough for this contract and enough to understand what are the pointers about the contracts, the data sharing agreement, and when it seems safe enough, or how do we know if it's safe enough to share information publicly. So I'll come straight to you. Sorry, Juliana. Juliana prepared a sheet for me to go through, and of course, I'm not following that. I promise that we'll go first to Juliana to give us an overview of the data that we have and the data that we do not have that might be difficult, so that we will make it concrete when we come eventually to Daniela. We will know which is the information for which clearly there is no doubt that people feel confident. I can share this piece of information, but there are other pieces of information that seem more difficult. And so maybe the pointer might be helpful there, and the discussion later can focus in particular to those areas where people seem to be more reluctant or doubtful about the information sharing. Thank you, Juliana, for this slide.
Yeah, no problem. Hi, everybody. I thought it would be a good idea to share with you a brief description of how much data we have in our impact bond data set and what are the variables where we have more data than others. As Mara was saying, INDIGO is not about reinventing the wheel. We really don't want to do that. We just want to use the data that is already there and put it together, do some quality assurance, and then offer it to the community of practitioners in the form of open data sets. If we go to the next slide, you will see all the things that we can do with our impact bond data set. I always like to describe our impact bond data set as something that is a product of the community. This is something that the GoLab is co-creating with a series of organizations. I'm sure you all know, but the impact bond data set exists because lots of organizations out there working on impact bond projects are sharing data on voluntary basis with this data set and with this community. And thanks to these organizations sharing data, today we can do many things and we can get many insights thanks to the impact bond data set. So for example, if you go to our website, there are lots of filters that you can use, and there are a series of data visualizations that you can easily access. You can see impact bonds in a particular policy sector. You can see impact bonds in a particular country or a particular region. If you click one more time, you will see something else, which is our famous network map. You can have a good idea of what are the networks of organizations working with impact bonds. So you can see who is investing in what type of projects, which are the service providers working with this approach, which are the governments working as outcome payers in these projects. If you click one more time, you will see a snapshot of our data dictionary. We have a data dictionary with data definitions, and this is not just for us to go and read the data definitions, but also to read the data definitions and to suggest improvements, or maybe to suggest updates, or to just create new data definitions as we did in our last Hack and Learn event. If we go to the next slide, you will see something new or relatively new, which is that now, together with the impact bond data set, you can access the data on the particular projects, but you can also go to particular case studies, which provide more information, more qualitative information on particular projects. And if you click again, you will see a snapshot of our latest video. We have a short video where you can learn how to use or how to make the most of our impact bond data set. So this is all to say that thanks to these organizations sharing data, we have many things now in the impact bond data set. However, I also want to share some, in the next slide, I want to share something about our data completeness report. I just picked here the main variables. This is not the whole impact bond data set, but this is what data looks like, at least now, or this is what data looked like on the 14th of November. You have the list of variables, and you also have the percentage of completeness. And this is color coded, so you will see that there are some variables with a number or a percentage in maybe red or maybe orange. Don't worry, because sometimes being in red or orange is not a problem. So for example, we have only 14% of projects with values in the alternative name variable. This is not a problem. Not every impact bond has an alternative name, so I wouldn't see something to solve here. But let's see what we have. We have very good coverage of the impact bonds names, the stage of development, very good coverage on dates. We have a very good idea of when contracts are signed and when projects are starting. We don't have a very good idea of when contracts are finishing. We have a very good idea of total investment commitments. You will see some reds here, but this is because most of the projects are sharing the exact value. Some of them are sharing ranges, like minimum and maximum amounts of potential investment. But I would say that on the overall, we have very good coverage of total investment commitment, dates, and stage of development. If we go to the next slide, you will see that we have, let's say, a medium level coverage of the maximum potential outcome payments. This is the size of the contract. We don't have good coverage of the maximum potential loss or the maximum potential return that the investor may get. Not very good coverage of the configuration of contracting parties, but very good coverage of the description of the intervention, the policy sector, the target population, and the number of individuals that are targeted. We don't have, only 10% of the projects have value for changes to the project due to COVID, but this is something that we would expect because not every project delivers a service during the pandemic. And if we go to my last slide, we will see that 43% of the projects are associated to a particular outcomes fund, but this is okay. Not every project has an outcome fund. We have great coverage of the delivery locations. We know who the service provider is, who is the outcome payer, who is the investor. We have a good idea of intermediate organizations, good idea of the outcome metrics. We even have 20% of projects with data on results. And when I say results, I mean outcomes data on how many outcomes you achieved. Again, it may not be as granular, as detailed as we wanted, but at least 20% of the projects have something on the results tab. And we really don't have good data on outcome pricings. But this is the data that we have, and this is the data that we don't have. And I thought it would be a good way to kick off this conversation. So I will leave it to Mara again. Let's see what we discuss here and how we can make sure that we complete the variables that we don't have data for. Thanks.
Thank you, Juliana. As Juliana mentioned, like it took quite a bit of time to gather this information as well. And gathering this information is one of the things that after consulting with many stakeholders in the sector, we were asked to do. So I think we came a very long way. It's still not perfect, but I hope the conversation today will help us making it more useful and making sure that we have the information that we need. So I'm coming finally to Daniela. Sorry for misaligning the speakers earlier. As I said, it's an informal meeting. Thank goodness. Daniela, we're coming to you. As I mentioned, Daniela is a finance lawyer with much expertise on the contracting aspects in outcome-based contracts. So Daniela, can you give us some pointers around the data aspects in these contracts?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Mara, for your introduction. As Mara says, I've worked on these kinds of contracts for actually about 8 years now, and I am not a specialist sort of data protection lawyer. I don't have any special knowledge in this, but I think that's actually also the good. I couldn't sit here and hope to advise you about every single jurisdiction that you might have an outcomes contract in, and every single point that you should think about in relation to data, but I can at least say, as a lawyer, these are the areas where I would be thinking about this, and these would be the things that I would be flagging or trying to get specialist advice on. And so wherever you have these issues in play, that's when you need to start thinking, can I share the data? So the kind of key areas are obviously data protection, which in most circumstances shouldn't be a problem. I don't think any of us would ever expect to be sharing data which could be linked to any specific individual when we're reporting on a project and making that data public. I think the only thing to flag is that you can potentially have issues where you have very small data sets or very unique features, which may mean, together with other information, that you could work out who an individual is, but again, fairly unlikely to be an issue. And similarly, if you've got aggregated data, there are also risks around, again, small data sets where you've got where there are sort of features. You could maybe identify a cohort or something, and then from that you might be able to identify individuals. Unlikely, but possible. And then competition law, this is sort of even harder to talk about generically, but in general, information which helps a market function efficiently is okay to share, provided that it isn't commercially sensitive. And then you have to start thinking about what commercially sensitive is. Most people will have a good sense of this from their own perspective, and it's very, very fact specific. So as a lawyer, it's incredibly hard to sort of specify exactly what will and what won't be. But price information is obviously more likely to be commercially sensitive, both cost data and potentially outcomes pricing. It's also worth thinking about timing. So where data might be commercially sensitive today, it might not be in a year's time or 2 years' time. Again, we can't put a date on that. It's not, there's not a rule that says in a year's time, that data is not commercially sensitive. It could be, it will completely depend on the functioning of the market. And if the market moves fast, then it could only take a year. If prices aren't changing very much, it could be 2, 3, 4 years. So you have to look at all the specific facts. Similarly, information that's already in the public domain can't be commercially sensitive. And then I think the other one is where we've prohibited it by a contract. Now, most contracts will have a confidentiality clause, and that confidentiality clause tends to say something fairly vague about information that by its nature ought to be considered confidential. And so isn't actually very helpful if you are in doubt as to whether a specific piece of information is confidential or not. Obviously, one way around this is checking with the other parties whether they're happy to share it. But I anecdotally know that is kind of tricky because, a year or two down the line, people go, oh, I don't know, it's not really my decision to make, and I don't really want to think about that right now. So the sort of default is to just say no, because that's the easier answer. One good way of getting clarity about this is upfront agreeing what is and what isn't going to be commercially sensitive. And just a plug for the template that I worked on with Rory and others from the Go Lab and a broader working group from the Pogo group, is that the template that we developed for outcomes contracts we use in the UK has got some transparency wording, which kind of has the upfront, we agree that XYZ will be made public and can be shared, and you can select what will and will not be able to be made public. And I think that the fields all match with the data set that Indigo has created. That's me.
Thank you, Daniela. I wonder if somebody can put a link to this template, Rory. Okay,
Done.
that's fine. Thank you. Ah, yes, I can see it now. Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniela. So those are some pointers that I think are extremely helpful as a guidance. I was frantically taking notes, and maybe we should write them up at the end of the session. For the rest of the session, as I said, I invited a number of speakers. I will give you a brief introduction of who is in the room, who will share a perspective. We have Philippe Messer from the National Lottery Community Fund. Philippe has been working on a number of different social investment contracts, grant programs, and various initiatives since the year 2010. So from the beginning of the social impact bond market, he's seen it all. He was also seconded and support the decision in a number of government departments, and in particular, the development of the Life Chances Fund in the UK. At the moment, his main focus is looking at the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund, another large fund in the UK. So Phil will really bring the perspective and the experience of the outcomes funder and also government, because he's been advising and working very, very closely with government. We have here Neveline Slingers from the South African Medical Research Council. She is the Social Impact Bond she works at the Social Impact Bond Office for HIV/AIDS TB research in South Africa. She has a lot of experience in program leadership, design, and implementation, and at the moment she is working closely for the development of impact bonds in South Africa and creating an ecosystem, including an ecosystem that creates data. And GoLab is in conversation, and we are hopefully hosting a data studio for Indigo, working under Neveline soon to grow the availability of information for the Sub-Saharan Africa continent and South Africa in particular. We have Pompey Ridar with us from NSD for Mothers. She is she's been attending many of our events and conferences, and those who know her, she is a great advocate for the use of market-based approaches to tackle social challenges. She worked for about 20 years on healthcare and financial sector solutions in India in particular. She is been leading the development of health and microinsurance products to give access to affordable healthcare. We have Rory, who is a member of the GoLab team with a passion for procurement. He leads the POGO initiative, the procurement of outcomes. And I forgot what it stands for. I just call it POGO, Rory. Help me here.
Procurement of Government Outcomes Club, the Oxford POGO Club.
Okay, the POGO Club. So he has a legal background, and he's doing a DP in public policy and public administration, but he has a passion for improving procurement and putting social value into procurement, and he has been a great advocate for government to not just buy outcomes, but also buy the data, so that we put this information out there. So this is I think a great panel, and I'm asking our Neveline and Pompey in particular, as a practitioner in the outcome-based partnership ecosystem, I'm asking them 3 questions. The first 2, I want to do a quick round of 2 questions that are around which are the data from other projects you would most be interested in having out there publicly. So every project has a lot of information. Which information from these other projects you would find particularly helpful and why? So we can data is collected for a purpose, which should be this data for which purpose. And if currently this information that you consider is important is not available at the moment where you are going. So I would like to go for a quick fire to our speakers on these three questions. And I'll start with Philip, and then I'll go to Neveline and Compi. And then I would like to open a more like solution-focused discussion on where do we go from here. But Phil, can I come to you first on the data that you think are most helpful to have out there and why, and where do you go now to find it?
Okay, the data that we have and hold for most of our projects, which is really useful, is information about the service user and to what degree they progressed through the pipeline to achieve outcomes. The information about the outcomes they've achieved, what were those outcomes and how much has been paid as a result of those outcomes, and the cost breakdown. And the information that I would like to have on top of that is a clear understanding of the cost basis, because a lot of the costs are quite difficult to actually define, because we're not doing high-level accountancy here, and a lot of stuff can end up in the wrong budget head and can lead to inconsistencies between the data, which undermines the total data. And secondly, while the other area that I would really like to get to the bottom of, and commercial sensitivity applies here quite a lot, is about provider costs. Because as a funder, we have lots of information about commissioners and about investors, and we know how much money goes out to providers, but we don't know any more than that. So I would like to see the experience from the perspective of the provider. What do they spend the money on? What do they take away? How much does a step down cost them? And how much surplus do they make? What's the benefit to the VCSE sector of actually being engaged with SIBs?
Thank you, Phil. Can I please put comments and raise your hand if you want to come into to any of the comments raised by our speakers? Can I come to you, Neveline? Like, which data would you like to see out there? For what purpose? And at the moment, where do you go?
Okay, thanks. Hi, everybody. I think I should just start by saying that we are at the process of about to launch a SIB, so you'll understand where all my questions are coming from. And we're just at the final approval stages. I think we found many gaps in data at every stage of the process. First of all, when we're trying to develop the intervention, so to try and choose the best geographical area, what is the program combination, but also what does it cost? So understanding what would be an achievable target at a reasonable cost. Given the fact that we started out knowing exactly how much outcomes funds would be available, but we then had to work backwards to try and figure out what could be delivered for that cost. And programs don't show a lot of information about what they're doing and what it's actually costing, what the true costs are. Data for the choice of the implementer. Looking back at it now, it would have been nice to know what investors look for in a due diligence, so that we can already make sure that we're focusing on that in the screening process. And also what assessment criteria to determine the necessary agility and leadership for the innovation and flexibility that you require of the implementer. We sort of struggled with that. We went a bit overboard maybe perhaps and set up technical committees with high-level people to be able to guide us through that. But it would have been easy if we'd known what we should be looking for. Obviously also information on how to cost the outcomes, especially if you have more than one outcome. You know, how do you split the pricing across the different outcomes when you're not quite sure how much the outcome funder would be willing to pay per outcome, because there is not enough information in that area. It would have been good to know about potential investors. what different investors are interested in, what is their ticket size, what is their interest in what is their interest in research as well, because we are wanting to do an impact and economic evaluation of this social outcomes-based contract. But it would be useful to, if you could go and check quickly where those things are available, because what we eventually did there was reach out to technical partners who work in this area. Then when it came to contracting, understanding what we should be looking for when we're dealing with the investor and the implementer, how to describe the flow of funds, how to deal with possible closure of the program, or even a change in the implementer, who takes responsibility, what happens if the program has to stop for any reason, and also how to share the risk between the stakeholders. We found that the investor is risk, when they use their usual legal support for such a contract, there's a lot of differences in terms of how it should come out in the contract as opposed to what they normally have. Data on the role of the performance manager, so how to choose one, how that works, how much you should cost, you should budget for that. The same with the independent verification agent function. How is that best to work, and how can you optimize that through the use of technology? That seems to be a big gap. And data on the economic benefits and the cost of the outcomes-based mechanism. So it was hard to make the case because there's not a lot of evidence on that. And in fact, that's what we want to do, is to contribute to that evidence. And also in our case, the government is interested in scaling up if we have a cost-effective, impactful program. Then data to inform the evaluation. Also any guidance on that would have been good in terms of what is the best evaluation design and what kind of proof would investors and outcomes funders be looking for. In terms of what we did, basically we went everywhere. We found the information, lots of intensive work, reaching out to technical service providers, using our relationships with stakeholders, a lot of trial and error, and that costs time, money, and a lot of going back. And so that whole process, due to the lack of that information, it definitely added to the time to develop the outcomes-based contract. Also, we had to, we even commissioned some research because there didn't seem to be some data available on some of the information that we were looking for. We had to look for preliminary data from other people who are doing similar things that might not have published their information, and then really using our resources to access data of surveys being done, but asking them to perhaps look at our particular geographical focus. So in essence, really a lot of extra work and time, and obviously cost to development of the contract. Thanks, Mara.
Thank you so much, Neveline. And interesting that you also pointed out the importance of understanding the cost of setting up an outcome-based partnership like Phil. I might come back to you because you said that you gathered this information and it took a lot of time and a lot of effort. And I wonder if you have an appetite to put it out in the public domain for people not to have to go through that again. It's just a warning that I'll come with this question to you. And I'm coming to Ponti. What is your experience of the data that you would like to see from other projects? And where do you find it now?
Thanks, Mara, for the question. So if I were to really talk about my experience, there is resistance, there are turf wars, and there is a lot of counterproductive processes that are happening from the beginning to the start. And after having done the development impact bond, the Utkarsh impact bond in India, we actually went through something which we call as an after action review to really understand what we could have possibly done better. And in that, I think the key things that we came out with was there are some data factors which need to be private. Privacy matters, and especially these impact women. and certain groups. And so one needs to be aware of what data should be treated as private, including costs, including where there are stakeholders who are taking risks, because this is about transferring risks to different stakeholders. So if you have to encourage data sharing and breaking this whole silo thinking, we have to build trust and therefore governance, setting up a governance right from the start where there's mutual understanding of the challenges and an agreement to review the way things are going in the field is very, very critical. And that is the trust that we saw, which really helped us tide when we faced with huge issues like an entire verification round failing. And so one has to understand that we are all mission aligned here. So we all want to succeed and to achieve those outcomes. However, I think how we achieve those outcomes and getting those insights of failures and successes is what we are wanting to share and is why we want that data. And without data and without metrics, all of this, benefits, especially around health and education, which is targeted benefits, where triangulation is very often done by government or by any other stakeholder. Without data, there's nothing that makes sense to anyone, even if you have achieved outcomes. That is our key lessons. So I think the critical step by step, what are the challenges that we faced, how we circumvented those challenges, and how we aligned our incentives so that we openly share data and anonymize the data. We're not saying that you share, specific data. So respect that. We need to anonymize it and build that trust between all the partners. Governance and open dialogue is, I think, most critical to breaking these silos and therefore making impact stick. So once you set that process, this can easily transition to a sustainable process that can be adopted by governments or by industry, whoever really cares for those outcomes. In our case, quality improvement. And I would also suggest that the verification component really not be treated as research. At the end of the day, it's verifying an outcome, and we should use the natural owners. In our case, like we started to use the accreditation body rather than a data collection agency. And that made all the difference, because once it was an accreditation body, there was transparency, there was an institution that was built, and systems and processes that everyone respected. Back to you, Mara.
Thank you, Paul. This is an interesting point that you raised. I wonder if I can call Andrew, if I see is participating in the call, Andrew Levitt from British Outcome Partnerships, who has been working hard in creating an ecosystem when none existed on bonds in the UK. And you've been asking from the beginning to set up a publicly available data set or help with figuring out what are the prices. Can you share a perspective? Can you bring the perspective of an investor? I know that you are not strictly speaking an investor, but you know what are the challenges and the interest when somebody is putting money at risk in this project. What is the information they want to see? Why they want to see that? Why not other? And how do you find this information at the moment?
Hi, Mara. Hi, everybody. First of all, apologies if you can hear background noise. The internet in my house isn't working today, so I've had to come to a cafe around the corner. But I hope you can hear me. So yeah, we're an intermediary. We act on behalf of a range of investors, including Big Society Capital, the Office of Civil Society, and Guys and St Thomas's Foundation. And we bid for and deliver a range of these contracts, or bid for, and sometimes we do part of delivery, sometimes we subcontract delivery to voluntary sector supply chain. And the data that we find really helpful when we're bidding for contracts is any information about what outcomes have been achieved in the past, and any information about the types of services or that worked and what didn't work. And the outcomes payer in the UK, who has been the best at providing that data, has been the Department for Housing, Communities and Local Government, which I think is now called the Department for Levelling Up. And they have historically published everything you need to bid for a contract. So they've published the number of outcomes that get achieved by each of the organisations delivering services. They've published the price of each outcome that they offered, and they've published a lot of detail on what types of strategies worked and what types of strategies didn't work, so that each time you bid for a contract, you can look at what's been achieved in the past and then try and do better. So yeah, our message to governments here and around the world would be copy that. You know, the two links that I put in the chat are two really detailed reports for a couple of sets of outcomes contracts, and they provide lots of really useful data. I mean, for us, that's everything you need to then bid for a similar contract in the future. Now, not every department has done that. The Department for Work and Pensions didn't publish the same level of detail. But yeah, we would encourage all bits of the public sector to publish that level of data, because that's really useful. And we publish data on our own, the contract we've been involved with. So on our website, we publish the number of outcomes achieved and the amount of money paid for the achievement of those outcomes. But it's better if it can be published by a government department in a official evaluation, because then people know where to look for it. I'm not sure people know where to find this data on our website, and they wouldn't necessarily look. So it is better if it comes from government.
Thank you, Andrew. Juliana, do we scoop up Andrew's data on INDIGO?
Yes, I think it's part of the 20% that have something on results.
Very good. Thank you for the best practice that you are sharing from like currently DLAC and the link that is in the chat. Poppy, can I come back to you? Because in the past we had conversation and you mentioned if sharing information and learning is one way to learn and grow a sector. And you talked to me in the past when we were at the conference with the example of microfinance as something that inspires you as a model to copy. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, thank you, Mara, for that question. So yes, I mean, I think it's all about joint learning when you're growing a sector and when you are kind of finding markets or growing markets or productizing solutions, and you're really looking at scale. That is what impact bonds are about. So I think that's where really sharing one's experiences in microfinance, for example, the rate of interest, the rate of default, the non-performing assets, and the geographies from where these were arising, and the reasons why the assets were turning non-performing were very critical. And these were kind of then shared in an information exchange that was set up for microfinance. So this was a case of self-regulation, where folks came together and said, in the interest of growing this sector, we need to share our data fairly with others. And I believe that this kind of data sharing is required for healthy competition and growth. And in the health sector, there is so much of data. One needs to be able to communicate how this data should be shared, how insight should be shared, while respecting privacy and by anonymizing the data in the interest of the providers themselves, for example. So if one anonymizes the data and can look at where they stand as compared to, say, other health facilities, and that is a great way for one to agree to give data in the first place and see where they stand in terms of, for example, number of patients who are coming in, or number of good specialist doctors that they're attracting, or health workers that they're attracting, and so on and so forth. And so folks should be encouraged to anonymize the data and give it while, you know, really targeting a broader outcome, which is, say, increased business, increased insurance patients, or quality accreditation, and moving up different levels of quality accreditation. So I think the right aligned incentives, and these need to be deliberated with the stakeholders, not developed in office and then go down to the field and start to implement that. Grounds up at the outset, developing these aligned incentives and agreement and what data is possible to collect and at what frequency and how it should be shared, what insights will be shared to which stakeholders is very critical. And that I've seen generally works.
Thank you, Pompey. This is a good suggestion and provocation also from us at GoLab to try to engage from the grounds up, really. And Phil, as you can see, you put a message. I was coming to you. Do you want to share your comments there? And then I'll go to Nevilin with my provocative question. Phil.
Yeah. One of the things we found is that our stakeholders don't tend to save the data. And there is a high turnover, particularly among commissioners, of people. And so the data and the story behind the data, the qualitative background to the data gets lost. So we want to see data transparency, and we're trying to share information through our program evaluation being done by Ecoris and ATQ. And we also want to work with GoLab to put as much information as we can onto the systems that are being developed through INDIGO, so that information is available long after CBO is finished, long after we have moved on to other things, and that data will be updated and refined. And we're looking at data not just for the CBO program itself, but beyond that, to try and maximize the amount of information that's available, because CBO is running with projects which last up to 10 years and we're not funding the whole of it. So let's try and get the information and the contacts through to GoLab so that you can actually progress that once CBO is finished and get a full picture of each project. So that's my message.
Thank you, Phil. I'm linking it back to what Daniela was saying in terms of maybe some of the information that might be considered sensitive. And Daniela mentioned prices. And at the same time, Andrew was saying, oh, one of the information that is most helpful to have for me is the outcome achieved, the price that was paid, what was effective in terms of the intervention, and the strategies that worked or didn't. And if some of these prices are sensitive, but they get lost over time because the people lose the data, it makes sense to have a good gathering, maybe with an embargo period. It's like, oh, this data can't be released for 2 years, or because it can be sensitive. But I can see shaping up a strategy of type of data that we need to prioritize and the risk of not having it. Nevilin, can I come to you, because you did all this background work to gather data that was not publicly available, and now that you have it, I can't resist the question, will you share it? And then Rory, can I then put you on the spotlight to help us put together some of the insights and wrap up from the GoLab perspective?
Okay, no, Mara, I'm not going to share. After all of that, no, I'm only joking. I mean, I think that your question really makes me think about what, and as people have spoken about, that you should start thinking about what data you're going to share how from the very beginning. You know, I mean, I think that we certainly want to share all our lessons learned and our outcomes achieved that we have no problem sharing. You know, I mean, that's always the idea. And in fact, we have set up a system to share the lessons as we learn them with a high level strategic team, so that actually other people can learn from that immediately. So that's one important thing for us. I think the pricing per outcome is a sensitive thing, and it's linked to the costing of the program. And the problem there is that it's market sensitive because there's lots of competition in the area of programming for adolescent girls and young women. and nobody really wants to put out there how much they pay for a particular deliverable. So our thinking is that, look, we have used insider information to try and to obviously put a cost to the budget for the implementer. But through our economic evaluation, we will then bring it all together. We'll say, you know, this is what we thought, this is our assumptions, this is what we actually paid per outcome, but this is what the economic evaluation shows. So we're thinking through the evaluations, we will capture the whole thinking along the line, and then it's easier to put that out at the end, you know, rather than fighting with other people or putting something out. And actually, I feel like if we're the first people who put out information on what we think it costs to reach a particular service, then it will be pulled down by everybody else and saying, we're much cheaper, don't go to them again. And we limit the chances of having similar outcomes-based contracts, you know. So I think through the economic evaluation and comparing, bringing the impact evaluation together as well, we could say this is the impact and this was the cost, you know. Then it's better than saying this is what it costs to run a program. Then at least it's part of a formal evaluation and it is more credible. We also realize that, you know, that's why we're working with GoLab to try and get a data steward, because some of the information actually is out there but needs to be collected, and we need somebody to focus on that because that takes a lot of effort. And also we're thinking of how we can use that person for advocacy, you know, because sharing of, as Poppy said, you know, in South Africa, government doesn't really share the information because it obviously links to, if you share information of your outcomes or your achievements, then people can question whether you've done a good enough job, you know, within the funding that you have. So it's very sensitive, but I think that we have to realize that we need to work with government to access that information. And I think if we show through our process evaluation and economic evaluation that this is the process that will happen when you apply and implement these outcomes-based contracts, you'll come closer to understanding what outcomes you need to focus on and how much they will cost, and also what the benefit would be. So we're kind of looking at it as a holistic approach to try and deal with that. In terms of, we will certainly go back to our contracts and say to the investor, what can we share and what can't we share? You know, because at the moment we've only spoken about it from the point of view of publications. And obviously we will launch the project, so there will be some information out there in the public domain, but I'm not sure what the investor is thinking, because this is the first outcomes-based contract in South Africa focusing on health, and the first one with government. So I presume that the investor also has particular interests in using that information, but we will now certainly learn and go back and see what they are willing to share. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. I'll come to you, Rory, to share your perspective. And Andrew or Pompey, can I ask you to put a link to the mix that you both agree is a helpful model to look at, this information exchange for microfinance, so that we can have a log and we can take inspiration from it. Rory.
Hi, thanks. A lot of this is public money, and there's a great movement towards open contracting, open data, and there's emerging evidence about the value of that. Mara initially talked about creating public good. And I think the Open Contracting Partnership has done a good job of summarizing some of the information there. But that, as Mara said, doesn't necessarily give us, give this group the sort of practical tools and understanding of like what the barriers are and how to overcome them. So I've been listening to what people have been saying, and I've tried to put these various barriers and various solutions into some categories. I've got 5 to offer. But one of the things I think was most striking to me was something that Andrew Levitt said about, governments should do this, and I personally would agree. My suggestion would be, even if we set aside the sort of like the public nature of this and that the public good can be created, that like the payers here, the commissioners or the governments, should really secure the learning, and the payers should really acquire and publish the data. I'll get to that a bit more in just a minute. But the 5 categories I'm hearing of challenges and solutions are 1, about outcominess, the fact that we're focused on outcomes. 2, the sort of melange here, that lots of different parties, different contracts, different jurisdictions. Some of this is public, some of this is private. The 3rd is the sort of risk of immediate scrutiny. The 4th is sort of misinterpretation, or like the need for that qualitative story. Phil talked about that. Neville talked a lot about the how. And then the 5th, the costs of actually doing this. Like, how can we do this efficiently? I've just got a couple of minutes here, so let me run through potential solutions that I heard from various people very briefly. So in the first thing, the outcomes, the fact that we're all focused on outcomes here and fixed prices for outcomes may make it more difficult to sort of identify, like the product of the services. So I think it is important that you identify early on, either add it in your contract that you want the data as the payer, or amend the contract to say we want this data. I think that'll clear up a lot. The second, the melange, the sort of all the various mix of different types of parties. Again, if you make it very clear that you want to buy this data or acquire this data in the contract, that will clear up a lot of the sort of public, private, and jurisdictional issues. The risk of immediate scrutiny. Daniela talked about time, Neveline talked about time. I think, that's real, right? There is a cost to explaining things immediately, and you may need time to adjust if there are challenges. So, maybe it's easier to put these things out at the end, or there's a delay. Risk of misinterpretation. This is the more qualitative stuff. Add words to these data, case studies, evaluations that focus on more qualitative stories, I think is important. And then finally, the how. Juliana emphasizes the data dictionary. Daniela talked about the template, and I know that Creative Commons, which has been around for about 20 years, has like standard form language and licenses for releasing data and other assets. So there you go. I think payers should be involved in this. Payers should acquire the data and publish it.
Thank you, Rory, for this pulling together. I agree. We had a lot of pointers here and a good start of the conversation in our peer learning. We are at time, so I know that many of you have other meeting to run to, and I just hope that these created some pointers and get some of your thinking going. Surely it has for us, and we'll try to play our role even better and stronger going forward. So thank you so much, and we'll see you at the next peer learning session.
Thanks, everybody.